Example 1a, factor, if possible, x squared minus 9. In this section, we will be factoring a difference of squares. As the notes state, when two perfect squares are being subtracted, factor by writing the binomial as a product of a sum and difference. To factor these problems, what we're going to do first is we will identify the perfect squares. And after we have identified the perfect squares, we will then write our binomials. So the first thing we will do is identify our perfect squares. So for this first part, x squared is already written as a perfect square, and 9 we could write it as 3 squared. Now that we have identified our perfect squares, now we will write our binomials. Our first binomial will be x minus 3, and our other binomial will be x plus 3. Keep in mind the x and the 3 come from our perfect squares. So if we were to multiply x minus 3 times x plus 3, we should get x squared minus 9. Keep in mind that's how we can check our work. Multiply the binomials together to get that original problem. Example 1b, factor if possible, x squared minus 64. Again, we will identify our perfect squares first, and then we'll write our binomials. X squared, already a perfect square, 64, 8 squared. Now that we have identified our perfect squares, now we'll write our binomials. So our binomials will be x minus 8, x plus 8. Example 1c, factor if possible, x squared minus 25. Let's begin by identifying our perfect squares. So x squared and 25 written as a perfect square will be 5 squared. Now that we have identified our perfect squares, now we'll write our binomials. So our binomials here will be x minus 5, x plus 5. Example 1d, factor if possible for x squared minus 81. We will identify our perfect squares and then we will write our binomials. Even though we see x squared, because of the 4, that's not yet a perfect square. So we'll write both of them as perfect squares first, and then we'll go ahead and write our binomials. So for x squared, we could write it as 2x, all of it squared. That would give us 4x squared. And 81, we could write it as 9 squared. So now that we have identified our perfect squares, now we write our binomials. So our binomials are 2x minus 9, 2x plus 9. Example 1e, factor if possible, x squared minus y squared. We will identify our perfect squares and then we'll write our binomials. From the structure of the problem, we can see that we have our perfect squares. So then we have our x squared and our y squared. So now that we have identified our perfect squares, let's write our binomials. So our binomials will be x minus y, x plus y. Example 1f, factor if possible, a squared minus b squared. Again, we will go ahead and identify our perfect squares, and once we have that, we'll write our binomials. As we can see, we already have our perfect squares since we have our a squared minus our b squared. So now that we have identified our perfect squares, now we'll write our binomials, and our binomials here will be a minus b, a plus b.